Today's video is on another highly requested topic, but I'm warning you right now that it's probably going to be a mess. We're going to be tackling video codecs, and I'm going to do everything I can to present as much useful information as possible in a logical order, but no promises. Let's get undone. Gerald Undone. He's crazy. What is happening, everybody? I'm Gerald Undone, and today we're talking about video codecs. Now, today's topic is huge, and there is zero chance that I'm going to be able to cover it all, so I do apologize ahead of time if I skip something that you would have liked more information on, but I'm going to try and cherry pick the information that I think will be useful to the average video shooter. So with that, there's some terms we need to cover so that we can effectively discuss the various video files that you'll encounter. And they are the intents of a codec, their naming conventions, and the containers they're stored in. And as always, we'll also be discussing the practical applications of this topic, including the usefulness of an external recorder. So when I say the intent of a codec, we're talking about its purpose, but let's just cover a quick definition of what a codec actually is. So codec is a portmanteau of coder-decoder because it's responsible for encoding and decoding a digital data stream. And codecs often go beyond encoding and decoding and also incorporate compression, which is a big part of what we're going to be talking about in this video. So when we ask what the purpose or intent of a codec is, we mean, is it being used for acquisition, delivery, or an intermediary? An acquisition codec is the one your camera uses to record the images that it sees as a file on your memory card. A delivery codec is the one you export from your editor when you're all finished with your project to deliver to the client or distribute to the web or present for broadcast. This can be the same as your acquisition codec, or it can be different if the situation requires. Lastly, an intermediary codec is the one that you use between your acquisition and delivery codecs and is usually chosen because it's more suitable for editing and post-production. Now, you don't need to memorize all that because we'll be coming back to it, but you just need to have a general idea of how they relate to one another. Finally, what are containers? Well, containers are like the box that the video and audio files and potentially the metadata are kept. An example would be an MP4 or an MOV. Now, these by themselves don't really tell you much, and they're not fully indicative of the quality or codec used. But you can draw some conclusions based on the container because there are some combinations that you just won't see. Okay, so with all that in mind, let's discuss some commonly encountered combinations that you're probably already familiar with so that we can build our knowledge off of it. And I think it makes sense to start with probably the most ubiquitous one, the H.264 codec. To start with a little history on the codec and its naming, its full name is the H.264 MPEG-4 Part 10 Advanced Video Coding, which is usually abbreviated to H.264 or MPEG-4 AVC. The reason why it has two names is because it was developed in partnership between two entities that had pre-existing naming conventions. One was using the H.26X convention and was just changing the last digit, and the other was using the MPEG-4 part number convention and was increasing the part number. The important thing to know here, though, is that they are the same, which helps explain why when you record on Sony, you see AVC, but when you record on Panasonic, you see H.264. Now, Sony actually took this a little bit further in 2012 with their XAVC format, which is of course built on MPEG-4 AVC, but uses one of the highest levels supported by that standard and is generally stored in an MXF container. Sony later streamlined that format for consumer products in 2013 with the XAVC-S, which is normally stored in an MP4 container, and it's the one that you'll find on the A7 series of cameras, including the A7 III. Outside of the Sony ecosystem, you'll find that the term H.264 is used more commonly in consumer cameras, but we're effectively talking about the same family of codecs. And so that should hopefully help answer a question I get asked all the time, which is what's the difference between H.264 and Sony's XAVC? And the answer is there isn't really much of a difference. Sony basically just specifically tuned H.264 for their needs. Now, in that last section, I said a couple words that need some elaboration. I mentioned levels and the MXF container. Containers, as we already talked about, are just the storage boxes for the video, and MXF is no different. It's just not found as commonly in consumer devices. MXF stands for Material Exchange Format, and it's a container that was intended to probably be a lot more popular than it is based on its versatility, but we'll be talking about it again when we get into DNx. But the most common containers for H.264 are the MOV and the MP4. The other term that I mentioned a moment ago, levels, refers to the specs of a given profile being used by that codec. These levels, which you'll usually find in your editing software as options like 4.1, 5, 5.1, detail the supported resolutions, the bitrate, and the decoding speeds of the codec. So for example, to get 4K 60p, you'll need level 5.2, because level 5.1 only supports up to 4K at 30 frames per second. You can easily look up a chart if you want to see the breakdown of the different levels, but I'll put some links in the description for the tables that we discussed throughout this video. Now, levels are different, but work in conjunction with the profile, which is basically the overall capabilities of the codec and is set with terms like main, high, and high 10. Profiles detail the broader capabilities of the codec with things like bit depth and chroma subsampling. And by bit depth, we mean the 8-bit or 10-bit, and for chroma subsampling, we mean 422 and 420. Now, I don't want to go into too much detail about those aspects because that's definitely a topic for another video, but in broad strokes, bit depth is basically how many colors you have per channel. The more bits, the more colors. And chroma subsampling is a method of reducing bandwidth by focusing more on luminance than on color. And the ratios, like 4 to 2 to 0 0 are detailing how much information was lost or combined during that process. Again, with this one, the higher the number the better, with 444 being the best. Now, the interesting thing about H.264 is how it's used. In the beginning, I said that there were generally 3 intentions of a codec: acquisition, intermediary, and delivery. But if you look at an average consumer's workflow for distribution on the internet, H.264, often in an MP4 container, is used for all 3. For example, I'm recording this on my GH5. Now, internally, the GH5 could record this video, which is 4K at 24 frames per second, in an MP4 container using the H.264 codec, and it can do that at 10-bit, that's the color bit depth, and at 422 Chroma subsampling. Now I could take that file and upload it straight to YouTube, and that would cover both the acquisition and the delivery in an H.264 MP4. And then YouTube would probably distribute it to your screens using H.264 as well. And if I wanted to edit that video before uploading, I would import those files into my editor, which is Premiere Pro, and keep it as an H.264 MP4. So that would make it my post-production codec as well. Now this doesn't exactly qualify as an intermediary because the codec isn't changing, but you get the idea. So it's pretty great that a codec can be so flexible and universal, but there are some serious drawbacks. First of all, that file I described, the 4K 10-bit 422 and an H.264 MP4, can be quite taxing on your computer to edit, so it doesn't make for the best post-production codec. And as an acquisition codec, it suffers from being in its lowest form from the get-go, with considerable data loss and compression. It is pretty great for web distribution, video streams, and RIPs intended for portability, but there are better performers in that area as well, they just aren't as well adopted yet. One of the most popular potential successors for this purpose would be the high-efficiency video codec HEVC, appropriately known as H.265. It's better for this kind of distribution because it can double the compression of H.264 but keep the same level of quality. So it gets smaller, but you don't lose anything. And you're starting to see HEVC show up as an acquisition codec in cameras these days too, with the latest GoPros offering H.265 to handle their higher resolutions. Now let's go back to the shortcomings of H.264 and build off of it by exploring some potential solutions. So we talked about how H.264 isn't the greatest for editing, and the first solution to this is actually included in many cameras, and it's called all-eye recording. Now this is another dense topic that I don't want to cover completely here, so I'm just going to speak generally about it. But the typical compression for H.264 uses something called IPB or LongGOP. GOP stands for group of pictures and refers to a sequence of frames which contain I, P, and B frames, hence IPB compression. Think of I frames or intra frames as a complete picture. But in order to save space, the codec also uses predictive frames, P frames, and bipredictive frames, B frames, to only render out the portions of the image that have changed throughout the sequence, rather than redrawing the whole image each time. This makes editing harder, because in order to pull up a frame of your video, the computer has to read and decode the frames before and after it in order to compile a full sense of that picture. And if you cut the footage, the IPB sequence needs to be recalculated in order for it to maintain its integrity at the cut, and this can really bog down your edit. All-I or all-intra attempts to solve this by only using the intra-frame compression of I frames and not bridging the gap with predictive frames. This means when you pull up a frame in your editor, you only need to pull up that one frame and not the surrounding ones. And when you place a cut, no extra work needs to be done, and this can make for significantly smoother editing performance. Now, all-I is just a compression technique, so it doesn't really help that much when it comes to acquisition quality. It's not going to change your bit depth or modify your subsampling, but it is more suitable for post-production and gets you closer to the performance of a dedicated intermediary codec. However, there are some serious limitations to all-intra, and they mostly have to do with storage space. Eliminating those P and B frames means that the bitrate and file sizes go up significantly because there's much more data being recorded. And because all-I is a solution built into cameras, it generally works off of the same card slots that you would use for IPB compression or photos. This means you'll likely have to purchase faster cards to handle the higher bitrate and larger capacity cards to grant you the same recording time. And when it comes to SD cards, really fast cards with high capacities are not priced very affordably on a $1 per gigabyte scale, but we'll talk more about that in a minute. The other issue that some people encounter with all-I is the read speed limitations of their hardware. A question I've been asked before is, why is all-I performing slower on my machine than LongGOP? I thought all-I was supposed to edit smoother. And in this case, often what it comes down to is hard drive speed. Older mechanical drives, especially those found in laptops, often can't feed the data fast enough to the editor for the all-I files like it could for the smaller IPB files, so in those cases, a faster solid-state drive is definitely required. Now I want to talk more about the intermediary intent of a codec. I mentioned that all-I can serve as a decent post-production codec, but there are others that do this much better, like ProRes and Avid DNx. When it comes to Avid, there's different codec groups. There's DNxHD, which stands for Digital Nonlinear Extensible High Definition, and is typically used for resolutions up to 1080p, and then there's DNxHR, Digital Nonlinear Extensible High Resolution, which is for resolutions above 1080p. These codecs are typically stored in the MXF container we were talking about earlier, but can also be stored in an MOV. When it comes to the HR variant, there are 5 distinct profiles, and these are kind of like the profiles we talked about with H.264, but they have the level component built in with predefined data rates. And the same is true for ProRes, which has 6 different versions, including a proxy variant. Now, there's quite a few commonalities between DNxHR and ProRes. For example, they both use a minimum Chroma subsampling of 422. They both use a intraframe compression method, so they're all I. They're both optimized for editing, and they both offer a range of different bit depths. When it comes down to choosing between the two, it's more important to look at compatibility than it is their specs. ProRes is an Apple codec, and thus is well tuned for use on a Mac, especially with Final Cut. Now, ProRes will also work with other NLEs, but most PC users report better performance when using DNxHR. Now, another thing that these codecs are commonly used for is making proxies. Proxies are just what they sound like. They're basically video files that stand in place of the original file to make it easier to edit. If you're working with source footage that's just too demanding to edit, you can make a proxy of that footage using a lower quality or bandwidth and using a more edit-friendly codec like ProRes or DNx. Then when your project is complete, you export the video, but it applies your edits to the original footage and exports it from it rather than from the proxies, so you retain full quality. This makes sense as something that you would do with massive raw files or uncompressed video that's just too difficult to work with, but a lot of people actually do this with their H.264 MP4s and use an intermediary codec like ProRes or DNx. The idea is that it's much easier to edit a 1080p or 720p ProRes video than it is a 4K H.264. It's important to remember, however, that this does not improve quality, because remember what we said earlier, that one of the disadvantages of H.264 is that you're starting off already compressed at sort of like that lowest common denominator. So even though ProRes can have better subsampling or more colors, you're not going to get those just from converting your footage from H.264 to ProRes or DNx. You're still going to be locked in at whatever you recorded at with H.264. Now, if you've been following up to this point, you might have concluded then that the best of both worlds would be to do your acquisition with a quality post-production codec like DNx or ProRes, and that's exactly what camera companies have concluded as well. These codecs may have started as intermediary formats, but they are becoming much more commonly offered as acquisition codecs. There are, however, some considerations to be made. ProRes and DNx take a lot more space and require much faster storage, faster and larger than most consumer cards can deal with at a reasonable price. To demonstrate this and give some more details about ProRes and DNxHR, let's do a small comparative case study with the Panasonic GH5. As I was saying earlier, this video was recorded in Ultra HD, which is 3840 by 2160 resolution, at 24 frames per second in 10-bit 422. If I use the standard LongGOP compression, which is offered by the GH5 for H.264, it's going to need 150 megabits per second, which is 18.75 megabytes per second, because 8 bits in a byte, so you divide 150 by 8 and you get 18.75 megabytes per second, which means it's going to take about 64 gigabytes to record about an hour of video. And this is manageable because any V30 SD card will be able to handle that. By the way, if you want to know more about designations and speeds and stuff like that of SD cards, make sure you check out my video on that. But basically, V30 means it can do 30 megabytes per second with video, and that's higher than 18.75. So we're okay. Now, if I change the compression from LongGOP to All-Intra, the bitrate increases from 150 megabits per second up to 400 megabits per second, which is 50 megabytes per second. And this now exceeds a V30 card, and you start to enter into the V60 and V90 card territory and into UHS-2 cards, which can cost up to 5 times as much. Also, the capacity of those cards will need to increase because it now takes 180 gigabytes to get an hour of recording time, up from 64. Now let's look at a comparable ProRes version. ProRes 422HQ would probably be the highest quality available if our GH5 could record ProRes internally. It would take full advantage of the 10-bit color and the oversampled image and give us the most latitude for grading and effects. But ProRes 422HQ, when recording an Ultra HD image at 24 frames per second like we are now, requires 707 megabits per second. That's 88.4 megabytes per second and nearing the upper limit for SD card recording. And even if it could, it's 320 gigabytes for every hour of footage, and that's just impractical. The same goes for DNxHR, which has a version called HQX, which is closely comparable to ProRes 422HQ, and this allows up to 12-bit 422 at 4K or Ultra HD. Again, I'll provide links if you want to see the complete tables for ProRes and DNx and compare data rates of the different versions. That'll be in the description below. DNxHR HQX comes in very close to the bitrate of ProRes 422HQ for our current setup at 83.26 megabytes per second, which again is going to be near the upper limit of SD cards and 300 gigabytes for every hour of filming. Now, cinema cameras are more capable of this type of intermediary codec recording right out of of the box, but it's pretty rare in consumer level cameras. Blackmagic's Pocket Cinema 4K is probably the most affordable camera I've ever seen to offer this. It offers RAW as well as 4 ProRes versions, and you can record this directly onto a solid-state drive via USB, so you don't have to inflate your budget with overpriced memory cards. But for consumer level cameras and even the pro level hybrids, you're going to need an external recorder to do this. If your camera supports a clean HDMI out, my recommendation would be the recently released Atomos Ninja V, which can record 4K, 10-bit, 422, up to 60 frames per second in both ProRes and DNxHR. And it also provides an excellent screen, which is doubly handy for those cameras that don't have a vari-angle display. And in the case of the GH5, it can take a clean, uncompressed signal over the HDMI and then capture it using the edit-friendly codec of your choosing. And the only cons I can really think of are storage space, reduced portability, and price. So for the reduced portability thing, there's no way around it. You're going to get bigger and heavier if you add a monitor recorder. The Ninja V I was particularly excited about because it's insanely compact for its capabilities, and the 5-inch screen is much more my speed, but like I said, it's definitely bigger and heavier than if you had no recorder at all. The storage concern is unimportant though, and I'll explain why in the price section. So the Ninja V costs around $700 US or $900 Canadian, and that's a decent chunk of change. There's definitely cheaper recorders out there, and there are also much more expensive ones. I do think the Ninja V is a pretty good value package and is priced really well, but it does cost quite a bit. However, when I got my GH5, I went all out on the SD cards because I wanted to be ready for the All-Intra firmware update that was coming out a few months later. I started with a pair of 64GB SanDisk UHS-2 cards that were close to 200 Canadian dollars each. That worked out to $450 with tax for 128 gigabytes. That's $3.50 per gigabyte. Now prices have come down a little bit since then, but if I compare that to this SSD that I got on sale just last week, which is the Samsung 860 EVO 1TB, it was $250 with tax, so that's 25 cents per gigabyte. That's 14 times cheaper than my SD cards were. And it's a hell of a lot more useful than SD cards for other applications because I can use it as an external drive or put it in a PC build down the road. My point is that while external recorders definitely cost some money, they significantly reduce your storage costs in the long run. Probably not enough to pay for themselves, but definitely enough to net a couple $100 of recoupment. So if we combine everything we covered in this video, I think that we can draw some conclusions. If we go back to the beginning when we talked about the intent of the codec and we talked about acquisition, intermediary, and delivery, I think the best acquisition ideally would be RAW. And then you would want to use a quality intermediary for editing, and then you would want to archive and potentially deliver in a perfectly suited quality DNxHR or ProRes version that suit that function. And then if you want to distribute to web, you would then do another export and convert to H.264 and use that for web delivery, which will probably soon enough be replaced by H.265. However, if you're shooting on a GH5 or a Sony a7 III or a Fuji X-T3 or any number of quality hybrid cameras, that ideal scenario just isn't an option. So what can you do? Well, if it's just for web delivery, you can run through the entire process using just H.264. And if the edit is bogging you down, you can create some proxies using ProRes or DNx in your editor for smoother performance. In fact, some of the cameras like the Sony actually allow for simultaneous proxy recording right on the card. So when you import the footage, the proxy is already created and ready to go. Alternatively, if you have access to large, fast cards and your camera supports it, you can use all-eye recording for smoother editing as well. But before you invest too heavy on expensive SD cards, consider getting an external recorder like the Atomos Ninja V if your camera supports it. Because solid-state drives are faster, cheaper, and more useful than SD cards, and it's a much cleaner and higher quality process to use ProRes or DNxHR as the acquisition codec instead of H.264. But now I want to hear from you. Let me know in the comments what your current codec workflow is and how it's working for you. And as a bonus question, I'd love to know what your ideal workflow would be if you could use any combination of hardware and software. Older mechanical drives, especially those found in lobsters, you also get a much higher bit depth. That's a funny one. I'm not gonna be able to say it right now. But that's gonna be it for me. I hope you found this video helpful or at least entertaining. And if you did, make sure you leave it the old thumbs up and consider subscribing if you haven't already. But if you did not find this video helpful or entertaining, feel free to hit the dislike button twice. All right, I'm done.